Marvin had been staring at the crooked "Help Wanted" sign so long the tape had fused to the glass like a fossilized plea. It flapped weakly every time the cafe door opened, the word "help" trembling just enough to make him feel judged. That morning, though, it wasn't the sign's silent mockery that got his attention. It was the figure sitting directly beneath it. She wasn't human. That much was obvious even before she shifted in the sunlight and her skin rippled like liquid starlight. She wore an oversized trench coat buttoned in the wrong order, a floppy sun hat that had lost the war with gravity, and boots that looked borrowed from 3 different centuries. She sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes like molten copper watching the traffic go by. Nobody went near her. They tried. A passing mailman glanced in her direction, then walked straight into a stop sign and apologized to it. A jogger stopped mid-stride, began reciting something about the shimmer of eternal longing to the sidewalk, and fled. Marvin sipped his coffee. He hadn't seen that level of romantic meltdown since prom night. Her presence came with a scent, more sensation than smell, like warm cinnamon tangled with lightning. It curled through the air vents and made the espresso machine hum in a low, guilty way. Marvin had seen 3 customers come in, order nothing, and wander out with blissed-out grins like they'd just been proposed to by the concept of joy itself. Every nerve in his body screamed *danger*, while every neglected corner of his heart whispered *finally star. He wiped down the counter for the 5th time, muttering to himself. He was down to 1 barista who called in emotionally unavailable twice a week, and he hadn't had a date since a woman named Tricia used the phrase platonic friend energy and patted his shoulder like a sad dog. Hiring anyone, literally anyone, would be better than bleeding money and sanity like this. Anyone, except maybe a pheromone exclamation point in trench coat form. But she stayed. Hours passed. Noon sun angled down and lit the word wanted across her shoulders like a celestial advertisement. Someone from the bakery across the street stepped outside, sniffed the air, and immediately proposed marriage to the parking meter. Marvin slapped the blinds closed. He told himself it was to block the glare, not to stop imagining what her voice might sound like wrapped around his name. Probably illegal. Definitely distracting. He'd spent years building this cafe, holding it together with caffeine, stubbornness, and duct tape. The last thing he needed was a cosmic distraction with a pulse and probable legal complications. At 3 o'clock, she turned her head just slightly, and for the first time Marvin saw her eyes up close. Not molten copper. Twin suns in eclipse. Heat flared in his chest, caught in his throat like the world's most ambitious hiccup. He inhaled too sharply, burned his tongue on his own coffee, and cursed softly in 3 dialects of regret. She tilted her head, watching him through the window, expression unreadable but curious, like a cat encountering its first doorbell. Something in Marvin, long buried under spilled milk and tax forms, lurched upright. He was tired. Tired of loneliness curling around his ankles like old smoke. Tired of thinking he wasn't worth anyone's notice unless he was holding a cappuccino. Tired of the silence in his apartment so thick it sometimes answered his questions just to keep him company. Maybe this was lunacy. But if lunacy was wearing a trench coat and glowing faintly, he could live with that. He shoved open the cafe door. The bell above it gave a nervous jingle, like it wanted to leave. Warm air wrapped around him, thick with cinnamon lightning, and his pulse tripped over itself. She blinked up at him. Up close, her skin wasn't just luminous, it moved, faint glimmers sliding across her cheeks like starlight trying to remember how to be freckles. Marvin's voice chose this moment to flee, leaving him with nothing but a half-swallowed cough and a vague gesture toward the window sign. Job, he managed, which was possibly the least seductive sentence ever spoken. She regarded him solemnly. Then, very slowly, she nodded. The motion sent a ripple through the air, a shimmer like heat haze, and Marvin's knees forgot how to alphabet. He braced himself on the doorframe, trying not to breathe too deeply. She rose in one fluid motion, taller than he expected, the trench coat swirling around her legs like a dramatic stage exit. Up close, she smelled like a bakery at the end of the universe, sweet and inevitable. Marvin's survival instincts were screaming about legal liability, HR policies, the risk of accidental public arousal incidents. His heart, however, was already clearing space for her on the payroll and maybe the couch. He extended a hand before he could think better of it. "I'm Marvin," he said, and winced because it came out sounding like an apology. She stared at his hand for a long moment, then placed her own in it. Warm. Very warm. The air between them tightened like a drawn bowstring. Her lips curved, just slightly, and her voice slid out low and smooth, with an accent like gravity had been optional wherever she learned to speak. "Zyra," she said. Marvin's name had never felt quite so naked. Behind them, the help wanted sign fluttered against the glass as if relieved, and Marvin had the distinct impression the cafe itself was holding its breath. He cleared his throat, tried to summon professionalism, and failed so spectacularly it might qualify as art. "Welcome aboard," he said. "Try not to explode anyone." Her smile deepened. "I will try." And just like that, Marvin realized he had either made the greatest decision of his life, or hired the reason it was about to catch fire. Marvin had never realized how much of running a cafe relied on not setting the place on fire until Zyra touched the espresso machine. One moment she was leaning close, eyes narrowing in concentration, and the next there was a sharp hiss, a flash of steam, and the entire milk jug had evaporated with a pitiful squeak. Marvin stood frozen, holding a training manual like a shield, wondering if the insurance forms had a checkbox for accidental vaporization by cosmic beauty. Zyra frowned at the empty jug as if it had offended her. "You said to steam the milk," she said, her tone carefully logical, like this was the jury's fault for not understanding interstellar syntax. "I meant, gently," Marvin replied, grabbing a fresh jug and clutching it like a baby goat. "As in asterisk not into the atmosphere. Asterisk." Her eyes brightened. "Ah. Simmer, not annihilate." "Exactly," he said, though his hands were shaking. He had worn a painter's respirator to try resisting her pheromones, but the cinnamon lightning scent still curled under the filter, making his thoughts go soft around the edges. She was trying, he could see that, but every gesture she made carried the casual grace of someone designed to break hearts by existing. Customers had begun showing up just to experience her. They didn't order coffee so much as fall in love with the idea of caffeine while gazing at her like pilgrims at a shrine. A man in a business suit came in, made direct eye contact, and immediately began reciting poetry about her elbows. A college student burst into tears, whispered, "She sees my soul," and tipped an entire paycheck into the jar. Marvin started handing out decaf samples as emotional first aid. He tried setting boundaries. Rule 1. No eye contact for more than 3 seconds, he told her, holding up a stopwatch. She stared at him for 4.5. The stopwatch exploded. Rule 2 was no humming. Zyra hummed once, soft, melodic, and the ceiling fans reversed direction while 3 pigeons outside the window synchronized into a perfect heart formation. Marvin wrote asterisk absolutely no humming asterisk on the staff whiteboard, underlined it 3 times, and added a small drawing of himself crying. Zyra, to her credit, tried to follow human etiquette. She introduced herself to customers in halting, careful syllables, mispronouncing Marvin's name as mating with such confidence that nobody questioned it. Marvin corrected her once. She smiled faintly and said, "Yes. Mating," and somehow the word folded itself around his spine like warm silk. He started answering to it by reflex. "Pass me the beans, mating," she would say, and Marvin's soul would attempt a backflip. He counted by layering defense strategies. Nose plugs, caffeine patches, even blasting subliminal tax law podcasts in one earbud. None of it helped. Her presence wrapped around his thoughts like soft gravity, tugging his focus toward her despite every stubborn instinct. Watching her try to tamp espresso grounds with the solemn care of someone diffusing a bomb was devastatingly endearing. She was earnest, clumsy, and breathtaking all at once, and Marvin hated how much he loved it. One afternoon, a line of customers had formed purely to receive their drinks from her hand. Marvin watched as she handed over a cappuccino and the recipient whispered, "I'd die for you," without breaking eye contact. Zyra tilted her head. "That will not be necessary," she said, dead serious, and Marvin choked on laughter until he saw spots. The register crashed under the weight of so many impulsive tips. Marvin had to invent new policies on the fly. No sonnets on napkins, no kneeling in worship during rush hour, and for the love of espresso, no attempts to serenade the barista. It almost worked, until Zaira tried latte art and produced a heart shape so perfect 3 people proposed to it. Marvin unplugged the machine and declared a 15-minute emotional recovery break. Somewhere between wiping down counters and restocking muffins, they began to laugh together. Not polite laughter but deep, collapsing snorts that left them gasping on the floor while the coffee grinder buzzed judgment ally nearby. She teased him for jumping every time she moved. He teased her for treating sugar packets like diplomatic gifts. They laughed until Marvin forgot he was supposed to be afraid of her. When they stood, brushing crumbs off their aprons, their hands touched by accident. It was nothing, bare skin for a heartbeat, but it was also everything. A warm spark zipped through Marvin's arm, setting off every dormant nerve like Christmas lights. Zaira froze, pupils dilating, and for once she looked almost shy. Marvin's breath caught in his chest. "Sorry," he said quickly, though he wasn't. She tilted her head again, that now familiar cat doorbell look, and said softly, "You are very brave, mating." He laughed nervously, cheeks burning. Brave is one word. Foolish is also a word. Perhaps both, she said, and her smile, small, uncertain, and luminous, hit him harder than any of the pheromones ever could. Marvin realized then that she wasn't some flawless cosmic siren. She was someone stranded in a world that couldn't understand her, trying desperately to learn the shape of human life without breaking it. And she was trusting him not to run away screaming. That trust wrapped around his ribs and squeezed until he could barely breathe, and for the first time in years, it felt good to be breathless. The bell over the door jingled as a new rush of customers stumbled in, already glassy-eyed and love-struck. Marvin sighed, shoved the nose plugs back in, and grabbed the milk jug like a weapon. Zaira straightened her hat, radiant and ready. Together, they stepped behind the counter, chaos incarnate and caffeine personified, and Marvin felt the strange, exhilarating certainty that the universe had just gotten a lot more complicated in the best possible way. By the end of the week, Marvin's cafe had become ground zero for emotional whiplash. People wandered insane and left dazed, clutching macchiatos like sacred relics, smiling like they'd just been personally complimented by the moon. He'd put up a sign that read *, please limit staring to 2 minutes, *, but nobody obeyed. Zaira had unknowingly triggered what Marvin could only describe as a cult of caffeinated infatuation, and he was the beleaguered high priest trying to keep the espresso machine from becoming a shrine. She was learning fast, though. Her hands had grown steadier, her voice a little warmer when she said customer names, though she still mangled them in ways that made people blush. "Here is your large, steamy Greg," she purred one afternoon, and Greg spilled the entire drink down his own shirt while thanking her profusely. Marvin started keeping a mop within arm's reach. The cafe had gone from sleepy corner shop to chaotic heart-melting hazard zone, and he was clinging to his sanity with both hands and a lot of duct tape. Zaira seemed oblivious to the commotion she caused. She moved through the cafe like an elegant comet, focused on tasks with almost military precision. Marvin watched her wrestle the pastry display into perfect alignment, tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth in concentration, and felt his rational mind unravel like wet tissue. He was supposed to be training her, but half the time he just stood there trying to remember how gravity worked while she existed at him. His employees had started taking emergency breaks just to recover from exposure. Worse, she'd developed curiosity. Human curiosity. She asked questions at random, each one detonating in Marvin's brain before he could answer. "Why do humans place lips on each other?" she asked while cleaning the blender. "Is this like taste testing emotional durability?" Marvin nearly swallowed his tongue. She asked about dating apps, then spent her lunch break reading profiles aloud in a tone like studying sacred texts, pausing only to ask, "Does looking for casual fun mean juggling?" Marvin didn't know how to explain without combusting, so he just nodded and pretended to be very busy wiping the same counter for the 12th time. Her pheromones hadn't lessened. If anything, they'd grown more potent as she relaxed around him. Marvin's defenses, nose plugs, tax podcasts, mental chants about profit margins, were crumbling. Every time she leaned close to reach a mug, every accidental brush of her arm against his set off sparks in places he had carefully ignored for years. She was heat and gravity and impossible sweetness, and he was losing the battle to remain composed. He caught himself staring more often, watching the way her smile tilted like she wasn't entirely used to the shape of it. It hit him like caffeine on an empty stomach, sharp, dizzying, addictive. Late one night, after closing, they sat at the back counter surrounded by the faint hiss of cooling machines. The air was thick with her cinnamon lightning scent, mingled now with roasted beans and exhaustion. She sipped hot chocolate with reverence, like tasting a secret. Marvin tried not to watch her lips but failed catastrophically. He could feel his pulse in his teeth. "You work too much," she said suddenly, eyes glowing soft in the dim light. "I have to," he replied, too quickly. "It's my place. My mess." "You carry it like armor," she murmured. "But armor is lonely." Marvin laughed, brittle and small. "So is being crushed by bills." She tilted her head, studying him. "You hide inside noise so you do not hear your silence." The words cracked something open in him. Nobody ever looked at Marvin and saw through. Nobody ever said the quiet things out loud. He blinked, caught between gratitude and panic. She reached out and touched his hand, featherlight. Warmth seeped through his skin like honey. The world narrowed to her fingertips resting on him, a single point of contact humming with possibility. "I do not wish you lonely," she said simply. His breath hitched. The room seemed to tilt, pulling them toward each other. He could hear his heartbeat pounding in the quiet, could see his reflection flickering in her eyes like twin suns caught in eclipse. There was nothing casual about her presence, nothing half-hearted. She was full gravity, and he was already falling. He swallowed hard, throat dry. "Zyra." She blinked, and something unguarded passed across her face, a flash of vulnerability so quick it made his chest ache. "Am I too much?" "Yes," he said honestly, voice rough. "But I don't care." For a long moment, she just watched him, and he could feel the weight of her gaze settle into the cracks of his fear like sunlight. Then she smiled, small, slow, devastating. "Then, I will stay." Marvin wasn't sure what he expected after that. Trumpets? Applause from the espresso machine? Instead there was just her, smiling at him like he was something worth choosing. It stole his words clean out of his throat. He smiled back, helpless. Something in the quiet between them felt suspended, as though the world had paused to let them catch up to it. He walked her to the door, because it seemed like the right thing to do, and she paused on the threshold, looking back at him. "Tomorrow," she said softly, and the word wrapped around him like a promise. When she stepped out into the night, Marvin stood there alone, the cafe humming around him like a creature content for the first time in years. He locked the door, heart hammering, and realized he was grinning like an idiot. His life had been small and predictable and gray for so long. Now it was a storm of color and risk and cinnamon lightning, and he wouldn't trade a second of it. Her skin still glimmered faintly under the cafe's dim lights as she perched on the counter like she owned it, sipping from a mug she definitely hadn't paid for. He watched her from the doorway, shirt half-buttoned and hair a mess, wondering how someone could look like chaos incarnate and still make him want to press pause on the universe. She flicked her eyes toward him, pupils wide and amused, and said, "So, are you going to fire me, or feed me again?" The way she dragged out the word feed made his ears heat. "Depends," he said, pulling the apron over his bare chest. "Are you planning to behave like an actual employee today or just distract the paying customers until they forget their names?" She grinned, and a pair of college boys at table 3 immediately dropped their spoons. "I am excellent at increasing foot traffic," she said, then tilted her head. "And mouth traffic." He choked on air, slammed the cash drawer shut, and muttered something about boundaries. She slid off the counter, landing with a lazy grace that made his knees feel like butter left too close to the stove. "I've been learning," she said, brushing imaginary dust from her thighs, "about human courtship customs. You give me small green papers, I give you prolonged eye contact and the illusion of attainable affection. It's very efficient." He was torn between laughing and locking the doors forever. "That's not technically wrong," he admitted, "but it's not how it's supposed to work in a workplace." She leaned in close enough for her breath to curl warm against his jaw. "So make it not a workplace," she murmured, and he had to grip the counter to stop his thoughts from sliding off like marbles on a tilt. He wanted to say something witty, something to cut the tension, but her hand found his apron tie and gave a curious tug that unraveled his entire argument. "We could discuss employee benefits," he managed, and she purred in a way that made the espresso machine hiss sympathetically. The lunch crowd chose that exact moment to barrel through the door, jangling the bell and breaking the spell. He jumped back, she smirked like she'd planned it, and he shoved the apron tie back into a knot that definitely wasn't regulation. By closing time, the cafe looked like a caffeine bomb had gone off. She had actually worked, sort of, though her definition of customer service seemed to involve leaning too far over tables and purring compliments that left tips bigger than the bill. He couldn't deny the numbers. Revenue was up, morale was dangerously up, but he wasn't sure how much longer he could survive her version of professionalism. When the last patron stumbled out, dazed and clutching a phone number she'd written in syrup, he locked the door and sagged against it. "We need to talk," he said, and she stretched like a satisfied cat. "Is this the part where you lecture me," she said, "or the part where you finally admit you like me here?" He opened his mouth to say both, but it came out more like a sigh. "You make everything complicated," he said. "No," she said softly, stepping closer, "I make everything interesting." Her voice dipped on the last word, and it curled through his chest like steam. He was supposed to be the rational one. He was supposed to set limits. Instead, he let her close the distance until her forehead pressed gently to his. "You don't even know if this will work," he whispered. "Neither does gravity," she replied, "but here we are." And then she kissed him, slow and deliberate, like tasting something new on the menu she wasn't sure she'd order twice but knew she had to sample at least once. The kiss stretched time thin. It was heat and static and the soft scrape of her nails over his jaw, and when they finally broke apart he realized his hands were tangled in the back of her uniform shirt like they were anchoring him to the planet. She looked dazed too, which was oddly comforting. "That was unprofessional," he said weakly. "Good," she said, and kissed him again, harder. The counter dug into his hips, the world tilted, and for the first time all day he didn't care if the coffee grinder exploded. They stumbled toward the back office, leaving a trail of receipts like breadcrumbs, and he was half laughing, half cursing, fully certain that this was either the best or the worst decision he'd ever make. When they finally collapsed on the old couch, tangled and breathless, she whispered, "So, am I hired?" And he said, "You're overqualified," just before she pulled him down into another kiss that made language irrelevant. Hours later, the cafe was dark and the universe felt strangely manageable. She lay curled against him, purring faintly, and he traced lazy circles on her shoulder. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," she said, "you stop pretending you can resist me." He laughed, low and tired and happier than he could remember being. "That sounds incredibly unprofessional." She bit his earlobe gently. "Good." And somehow, with her laughter curling around him like gravity, he decided professionalism was wildly overrated.